Hey there, Pastor Marc here. It's our prayer that this message would encourage and equip you in your relationship with Jesus. We're able to provide this content due to the joyful generosity of our financial partners. And if you'd be willing to join that tribe and help get some sermons like this around the world, you can donate at harvestbaptist.info/give. God bless. Philippians chapter number 1. Philippians 1 is where we're going to start today. We've been working through a long series on how we change for the better, how God changes us as Christians and matures us and grows us as Christians. And we've covered a lot of topics, but we find ourselves on the topic of the church and specifically how the church is used for our growth and maturation. And last week, we looked at a little bit of the structure of the church. We looked at Ephesians 2, where we're told that the church is founded on Jesus first and foremost. He's the chief cornerstone. Everyone takes their cues from him. Everyone has to line up with him. But then there is a foundation of the apostles and the prophets that are also there, that we are thankful for the apostles' teaching. We're thankful for the prophetic ministry that was in the early church. And then we're fit together and we're built together so that the Spirit of God can come and in a unique way dwell in our midst when we're together as the church. And I want to expand on that topic of structure and how the church is supposed to be formed or how it's fitly framed together by covering the topic. It's kind of a two-part sermon, part one this week and part two next week. This week we'll specifically examine the idea of the pastor and what role and what responsibilities he has within the local church. And I think that that's important because if I asked you, what do you expect of a pastor? I may get a smattering of answers. Some of you might say, well, I expect someone to make house calls, kind of like an old country doctor, and to be there. Some of you might say someone who shakes hands like a politician and smiles and is winsome and can work the crowd in the lobby. Some of you might say someone who has just exceptional oratory skills and can put together some lessons like a professor or someone. Perhaps someone to hold your hand when you're down or to encourage you through a tough time of life, or maybe even someone to be there through the big moments of life. You know, marry them, bury them, be there for the babies when they're born, those sorts of things. Perhaps you would expect a pastor to be a brilliant organizer or a visionary, to somehow reflect kind of a CEO. I mean, he's like the pastor and the president of a nonprofit, kind of legally speaking. And I would expect him to have a measure of savviness and maybe even shrewdness financially. Perhaps you would expect him to do counseling and to see as many people as a psychologist sees in a week. You know, what are the expectations you would have of a pastor? What does a pastor expect of himself? Yeah, those are important questions because many a church have been ruined and the relationship between the pastor and the church has eroded over time because there were conflicting expectations. The church was expecting X, but the pastor was expecting Y, and it creates a lot of tension and ultimately can be to the peril of a church. So I think it's essential from time to time for a church to review what does the Bible say is expected of a pastor. And we're going to lay it out kind of in three pieces this morning. That there are unique rules for a pastor, there are unique responsibilities for a pastor, and there are unique rewards for a pastor. All three are comprised in the pastorate. But let's begin the journey with Philippians chapter number 1, verse number 1. This is like the world's simplest verse on maybe structure and how the local church is organized. Here is Paul and Timotheus, Paul an apostle, Timothy a pastor, writing to the church at Philippi. And they say, Paul and Timotheus, servants of Jesus Christ, to, and listen for the three distinct groups of people. Number one, to all the saints in Christ Jesus, which are at Philippi, with, here's kind of cluster number 2, the bishops, and cluster number 3, the deacons. That is the simple structure of a local church. There are what I'm calling shepherds, servants, and saints. Next week, your title of your sermon will be Shepherds, Servants, and Saints, Part 2, because this is Part 1. We're just going to cover the shepherds. That is listed there when he says, I'm writing to the bishops. Bishops and shepherds would be synonyms of each other in many ways. Then you have the deacons. The deacon literally means servant. They're servants. But then there's also the saints, the people who are regenerate, who are born again, who are saved, who know Jesus as their Savior. And every local church should have some pastors, some deacons, and then the saints all put together to make up that local body. So let's talk about the shepherds. I want to start just with a statement. In the New Testament, the elder is the pastor, is the bishop. This is an important concept to understand because pragmatically it starts to have a lot of function. The elder is the pastor, is the bishop. You will see when you read about pastoral ministry in the New Testament, different words used to describe different facets of the pastorate. One would be elder. It's used very frequently. Another would be bishop, or sometimes it's translated overseer. That is used very frequently. The one that's used infrequently is shepherd, or the Latin term for that, pastor. And we use pastor, which is appropriate to use, but it's actually the one that's used the least if you read the New Testament. And when you read the New Testament, you don't want to come away with the sense that the elders are kind of one group of people, and the bishops are another group of people, and the pastors are another group of people, and these are all distinct from each other. No. They're all describing the same office. You say, Pastor, can you prove that? Yes. I'll give you a text right now, and I'll give you one at the end, and there's a few others that I could give you. But for example, Acts chapter number 20, Paul is bidding farewell to the pastors/elders that were at the church of Ephesus. And you find that from Miletus, he calls, or he sends to Ephesus, and he called for the elders of the church. That's interesting. Elders, plural, church, singular. In a healthy church, there will be multiple pastors or elders or bishops that are there to help guide the church spiritually. There'll be more than one. It's not just like, well, that's the pastor, that's the man. If you ever met me for the first time and asked, what do you do? Are you pastor? Those sorts of things. And I'm getting less and less of the, are you the youth pastor? I'm going bald on top. I have a beard now. I've been here 8 years. So it used to be, are you the youth pastor? All the time. I'm getting a little less of that now. But I will tell people I'm one of the pastors, which is, it's not just like, oh, that's a humble statement or something. No. That is true. I'm one of 6 pastors here at the church. Paul calls for the elders, and listen to the instruction that he gives the elders. Take heed, therefore, unto yourselves and to all the flock. Well, flock is the idea of shepherding and pastoring. Take heed to all the flock, over which the Holy Ghost has made you overseers. Overseers is the word episkopos. It's the same word for bishop. You elders are going to bishop the flock. You elders are going to bishop and oversee and pastor the sheep, over which he's made you overseers, and also feed the church of God, which is the idea of pastoring, which he has purchased with his own blood. These are all the same people. The elder is the pastor, is the bishop. That makes sense? I say all that not to give you a boring, lesson on terminology and synonyms and those sorts of things, but I say all that because there are very practical underpinnings, both in what elder, pastor, bishop mean, but then also that the idea in the New Testament is not one bishop over a bunch of churches. It is actually quite the opposite. It is one church who has a number of bishops. And there are a lot of churches that function basically as there's a bishop who's the regional superintendent and has lots of churches underneath him, which is kind of backwards from what the New Testament actually describes. So if you begin to learn just from the definitions, you would find first elder. Elder would be similar to what you would think of like obey your elders or those who are older. It comes from kind of Jewish life, that there were elders in the community who both by nature of their maturation physically, they had more birthdays than other people, and their maturation just in wisdom and learning, that they would be selected to guide the community oftentimes. The elder in the church isn't so much the physical maturation or they're just older, but it speaks to the idea of spiritual maturation and that spiritually they would be able to guide others because there's a level of maturity there so that people could in some ways follow their faith. We all follow Jesus, but it was appropriate for Paul to say, hey, I want you to follow my faith. Follow me as I follow Christ. That's part of the job of a pastor, elder, bishop. There's this sense of maturity that should be there. There's also the word pastor, Latin for shepherd, which means, well, that person is going to guide, that person is going to feed, that person is going to instruct, at times discipline or correct, and is going to have a flock under them. Then there is the word bishop, which is literally overseer. It speaks of someone who has the primary oversight of God's people in a local place. All describing kind of different aspects. Bishop has a little more administration. Pastor has a little more people love and care. Elder has a bit more maybe teaching or maturity spiritually. But they all come together to form this office. Now, this is a line of demarcation between our church and a Catholic church or an Anglican church or a Lutheran church or a Methodist church or a Presbyterian church, because all of those in one way or another function with a bishop being separate from a pastor and the bishop overseeing multiple pastors in multiple churches and kind of having the pastors on a leash, so to speak. In the Catholic tradition, you'll have priests, but then there's a bishop over the region. And then over that bishop is an archbishop who oversees many bishops, and then ultimately kind of all the way on up the org chart, all the way to the Pope. But the bishop oversees many churches of priests. You would have a very, very similar concept in the Anglican tradition. You would have in the Methodist tradition something that's sort of similar. They would have the Council of Bishops. That there's these thousands of ministers, and there's going to be a select few of them. I don't even know the exact number. I think it's 50 to 100 or so. And they're going to serve as the council and kind of set doctrine, the pace, the tone, what we believe, don't believe, those sorts of things for the churches that are under us as the Council of Bishops. Presbyterians would oftentimes have something very similar in that there's the presbytery. It's a very similar concept kind of to the Methodists, in that there's a small group of ministers responsible for overseeing the elders of the church in that region. This is something that we would look at and say, I struggle to see that biblically, so we don't personally have a structure like that. Our structure is one that is far more localized. And there are unique dangers to pulling a structure where there's a bishop who oversees the pastors. It doesn't make sense grammatically when you actually read the text, really, but there's also pitfalls. And some have said, well, aren't there unique pitfalls to doing like local autonomous church, of which we are? And there are, and I'll talk about those in a minute. It's a fair criticism to say, well, you could lack accountability, or the pastor can just do whatever he wants and be the dictator. That's fair. But in the method where there's a bishop who oversees the pastors, it's really not a biblical concept, and it can become very wonky very quickly, where there's groups, there's people that start to put their tentacles inside of the church and control things that they're not really meant to control. This happens to me very regularly, that I will have conversations with pastors, oftentimes of other denominational backgrounds and those sorts of things. And I was just thinking through, as I prepared the sermon this week, conversations I've had in the last 12 months with local pastors from our area of basically this concept going wrong. And I'll spare their names or the local congregations. I'll have a measure of anonymity there. But I had one conversation with a Christian Missionary Alliance pastor, and this didn't happen in the last 12 months, but he was just telling it to me and kind of reviewing how he came to be at his church and those sorts of things. But there was a really just small kind of minute wrinkle in their doctrinal statement that he didn't personally agree with, something that would have been relatively trivial. And he had let the bishop of the region, what they, I think, call superintendent, know this years prior when he started pastoring. And the superintendent said, yeah, that's very ancillary. It doesn't really matter. No big deal. So pastored and loved the church, the people, all those sorts of things. Fast forward, and a new superintendent comes in, and just to put all the cards on the table, let the new superintendent know what he had let the old superintendent know, but the new superintendent wasn't cool with it. and said, listen, you're going to change that, and you're going to publicly declare that you're going to change that, or we're going to remove you from the church. Why? Because the bishop or the superintendent had that authority. I'm going to take you out of that church. And it produced a year of, you can imagine, drama and contention and fighting and what are we going to do? Because legally speaking, they had the right to do that. And it ultimately landed with the pastor saying, you know what? I'm done with this. I'm moving down the street. I'm starting my own church. And the whole church just went with them. And they had a new building and a new name and just kind of went down the street. But there's unique dangers there. Even us as a Baptist church, we're autonomous. Most Baptist churches didn't used to be really that autonomous. If you went back 100 years, it was almost impossible to find a Baptist church that was autonomous. Most in this region would have belonged to what was known as the Northern Baptist Convention that has changed and shifted and renamed and things as time has gone on. But the Northern Baptist Convention basically went heretical. Like what they were teaching in seminary, what they were espousing, I mean, they lost sight of missions and began to teach some things that weren't just like, oh, we can agree to disagree, but were straight up heresy, literally. And churches said, well, we're not going to belong to you anymore. We're going to go out on our own. But not realizing many of them, the denomination owned the buildings, the denomination owned the land. And now we have to give up all that stuff that we sacrificed, that we gave for, and it's not ours. Many of the pastors, if not all of them, had their retirement funds run through the denomination. So now you're a pastor, and you can leave the denomination, but then you're leaving all your retirement behind. It's done. It's gone. It's over. And while it's easy to say, well, act on principle, and you should separate because it's heretical now, you're not 57 years old and just moved your mom into your basement to care for her in the latter years of life, and now you're facing losing your retirement. Like that's real life. It's hard to just let that go when you're planning on that money. And you can see why when you have something above the church, some sort of bishop set up above the church, that can get very messy very quickly. So we operate on the assumption that when you see the bishop or the elder or the pastor, that is referring to the same person scripturally, and that our church functions locally. There are saints, there are deacons, there are bishops that are all put together, subject to the scriptures and subject to the Lord Jesus himself, but there's not some sort of large hierarchy above us. That makes sense? It's part of how we function and how we're structured just here locally as a church. You say, okay, great. If it's kind of that simple, then what are the roles and responsibilities of these shepherds, bishops, pastors, elders? What about the deacons? How do they function? What about us as congregants? And we'll cover all that, but today is just the shepherds. I want to start with the unique rules that a pastor has. I will apologize in advance, and that this will be more teachy and less preachy. This will lack a ton of personal application. But I do think it's deeply important for a church to review from time to time what is expected, what are the qualifications of a pastor. Are there any? There are. We're going to read the list here in 1 Timothy chapter number 3, and before we read the list, quote D.A. Carson. He said, this particular list is remarkable because it's so unremarkable. And by unremarkable, he doesn't mean that there's not a high bar being set. He means almost everything that's listed here that a pastor should do is also expected of any Christian, whether they're a pastor or not. There are two exceptions to that rule that I will note as we move through them, but almost every single instance, when it says the pastor should be the husband of one wife, does that mean, well, that's the pastor's job. I can have as many wives as I want? No. When it says the pastor shouldn't be given to wine, he shouldn't be drunk and addicted to wine, does that mean, well, that's the pastor's job. I can get drunk all I want? No, obviously not. Almost all of these are expected of all of us. So it's unremarkable in that way, but it is a remarkable list that's expected of the pastorate. 1 Timothy 3, let us work through it together. Verse number 1. This is a true saying. We're going to read 7 verses. If a man desires the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. If a man wants to be an elder, if a man wants to be a pastor, if a man wants to be a bishop, good. Don't pour water on that fire. Do not try to stop them or preclude them or somehow shame them because they have some sort of compulsion internally that they desire to be a pastor. Sure, you could want it for wrong reasons. It could be that you want it for pride or something like that. But that's a good thing. We need more pastors. We need people. It's a good work. The office of a bishop is a good work. Now, I will note, it's a work. It's not, well, prepare a sermon, then sit on my hands all week and do nothing. No, there's a lot of work involved in pastoring, and pastors should understand that. By and large, they do, although it is a fair criticism for some to think, well, what's the pastor do? He prepares a sermon, he golfs all week, then he preaches on Sunday, and what's he do with the rest of his time? That does happen in some churches. It shouldn't. It's a shame. Alistair Begg once preached to ministers, and he listed the 3 scourges of pastoral ministry. And it was pastors who wanted to shine, pastors who wanted to whine, and pastors who wanted to recline. People who were in it for the pride and just wanted attaboys all the time. People who wanted to whine and constantly, oh, you don't know how hard it is, you know how tired I am, heavy is the head that wears the crown, wow, wow, wow. And the people who wanted to recline, they just wanted to basically be lazy. And he's not wrong on that. But the office of a pastor is something that it's good to desire. That desire should be of the Lord, not from your mama or your daddy or your grandma. You should desire it for yourself. And it's a work. Well, what would that pastor look like? Well, it tells you in verse number 2. The bishop then must be blameless. This is an important phrase. Those who are in a position of leadership need to be seen as clearly marked by godly living. There needs to be a measure of demonstrated maturity in their Christian life. The pastor's life is meant to reflect Christian values, not just when he's in the pulpit or when he's quote unquote at work, but at all times. It needs to be more than being gifted. It's not just you're gifted at public speaking so you can be a pastor. That's not it. Character is supposed to come first. And the seeds of giftedness are supposed to grow in the soil of character. That's what's meant for a pastor. So in leadership, the consideration of character is extremely important because in a country, in a business, in a family, in a church, as the leader goes, so goes the rest of them. That's how it works. It is true of every church I've ever been a part of that the church, not perfectly, not uniformly, but in large part begins to reflect both the character, the priorities, and even in some ways the personality of the pastors. It is impossible not to. Just like it's impossible for you to not be somewhat like your dad when you spent 18 years in a house with your dad. You can't not be. If the pastors are enthusiastic about evangelism, then the church, by and large, will evangelize. If the pastors love the word and want to study the word and want to constantly ask, what does God's word say? Then the people, by and large, will begin to ask, what does God's word say? And they will be enthusiastic about the word. If the pastors are personable and warm, the church will begin to be personable and warm. It's just the way that it goes. There is a level of maturity that the pastors have to have because the church should not be expected to exceed the level of maturity that the pastor has, which is obviously a statement that is so threatening and serious and in some ways almost condemning, like on my own personal life or on a pastor's life, to think about it in those terms. Like that is a weight and a responsibility that should not be just quickly disregarded. There needs to be character and there needs to be leadership. It's not that the pastor is blameless in the sense of no one could ever poke a hole or that they're perfect, that they're super saint. It's not saying that. But it is saying that there needs to be consistent spiritual maturity demonstrated. And in many ways, you could put a colon. There's not a colon in here, but you could almost put a colon after the word blameless, and the rest of the descriptors would begin to show you what it would look like to be blameless. So it goes on to say that he must be the husband of one wife. We could do an entire sermon on this phrase because there has been a considerable amount of debate on this particular phrase. Normally those debates engender a lot more heat than they do light, to tell you the truth. And I'm going to skim through all of these at about 5,000 foot. We're not going to spend a ton of time on any one of them. But people ask, Is this saying husband? He needs to be a man. Is this saying husband? He needs to be married, can't be single. Is this saying of one wife? You can't be a homosexual, it has to be wife, not a husband, not a husband of a husband. Is it saying he needs to be husband of one wife? He can't be a polygamist. One wife, he can't be a divorcee. Like there's all these questions surrounding it, right? Maybe the answer is D, all of the above. It's unlikely that it's speaking of singleness, both because Paul functioned as an apostle and a pastor and was single, and also because if he wanted to talk about singleness, he'd probably just say a husband, and he would have left it there. The of one wife part seems to indicate that polygamy or divorce is more in hand here. You say, which one? I don't know that they're mutually exclusive. I think that both could be in hand here, and that is a requirement here at our church that if someone wants to be a pastor, then there needs to be one wife, not polygamy, and there needs to be no divorces. And people debate that, and it's a fair debate to have. Well, if the divorce was before they got saved, and then they got saved, and it doesn't matter, and those sorts of things. Fine to have a debate, but I think we can all agree on this. If you put this together with a phrase that's going to come in a minute, that his whole house has to be in subjection, and if he can't rule his own house, how can he rule the house of God? There is extreme importance and probably more press than anything else in the whole qualifications. There's more press given to the man's home life than there is anything. The reality is he needs to have his house in order, like his actual home. The wife, children, home life, there needs to be a measure of health there, and if there is not a measure of health there, then they shouldn't be expected to lead the church. So it's fair to say that the man must have some sort of functional marriage if he is married, and there shouldn't be this smattering of divorces or lots of women. Like that's just not fitting. There should be fidelity, there should be purity, there should be consistency and faithfulness inside of this man in relationship to his marriage. It goes on to say that he should be vigilant and sober. It'll talk about alcohol in a moment, but sober is not talking about that here. It's kind of the same idea, serious-minded. In the same way that you would rightfully expect that if you jump on an airplane, in the cockpit of that airplane, as they transport you from point A to point B, there should be a measure of sober-mindedness and serious-mindedness in that cockpit. They should not be playing games. They should not be taking naps. They should be doing their job. They should be taking it seriously, and you would be appalled to find them playing Candy Crush on their phone, right? In the same way, the pastor is meant to be serious-minded and should not be a slough or a goof or someone who doesn't take the job seriously. There's vigilant and soberness. There's of good behavior, meaning not just moral behavior, but well-arranged and his house is in order. That if he is so disheveled and so out of sorts in all these areas of his life, his vehicle constantly breaks down and his finances are in disarray and his family isn't put together and all these things, then you shouldn't expect that person to be a pastor. You're not going to give them oversight of more if they can't handle a little. There's good behavior. There's given to hospitality. Meaning, while a pastor is expected, and we'll hit this in a moment, he is expected to deliver the word and to preach. He is not a recluse who spends his time in an ivory tower, study, pray, study, deliver sermon, go back to it, the end. There's more to pastoral ministry than that. There is given to hospitality. When you come across him, he should feel a little bit like a hospital. He should feel like a place that would want to care and want to help you, want to put you back together if you're broken in some ways. He should not be so isolated that he now is just this hermit and he doesn't like people. You could never find him. You could never get a hold of him. That's not pastoring. You're with sheep and you're with people. Now, as a church grows, there begins to be more and more pastors, and they begin to share in that responsibility because it would be impossible for one person, including yours truly, to function in that way to everybody, but there should be pastoral hospitality, not given to wine. This is another one that is very debated. Some would say that this precludes a pastor from ever touching alcohol, period, and that this is a teetotaling sort of phrase. It's hard to reconcile that with the same author telling the same guy, Timothy the pastor here, to take a little bit of wine for his stomach's sake. It's hard to reconcile teetotaling with this verse. So it's very likely, I think even more than probable, just kind of the plain sense of this verse, is that there is no sort of addiction that wine or alcohol do not have their hooks in this man in any way, shape, or form. He is not a wino. He is not known for sitting at the bar with a whiskey in his hand all the time. He is not given to that. He's not addicted to it. He's not given to it. I will say this, just because I feel like it probably. For those that want to be super duper duper granular on the husband of one wife verse, you would have to do the same thing with this. So if someone wants to say, well, husband of one wife, that means they can't be single, and you want to, parse everything out, then someone could take that same logic and say, well, he can't be given to wine. He can be given to bourbon, but not to wine. It doesn't say bourbon. It's like, no, you can't do that. You can't say, well, it means alcohol, but if he's a drug addict, no problem, right? There is a measure of common sense that you have to apply to the text to say, hey, this man can't be addicted by these substances. If you're sending your pastor on sabbatical because he's actually going to rehab, that's a problem. You should probably change that, That's fair. That's fair to expect of a pastor. It really is. No striker. He's not violent. He's not physical. He's not bullying his way through life. Not greedy, excuse me, a filthy lucre. He's not consumed, motivated, driven by money. It is not to say he takes the vow of poverty, that's not there, but that he isn't controlled, and it's clear that he isn't all about the money. Patient, not a brawler, not covetous. These all indicate a very similar concept of being patient and not fighting and not wanting things that you don't have. Verse 4 gives you, and verse 5, this tremendous amount of press on what I referenced earlier. One, that rules well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man knows not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? That's a fair question. Now, that's a unique weight that is given to a pastor. Every Christian, every husband and father is expected to be a good husband and father, and to not provoke your children to wrath, and that children should obey their parents in the Lord. That's true for all Christians. But there is a unique weight in the sense of this man's office, this man's job depends on that. Your job likely does not depend on that. For most of you, if you get a divorce, you can show up to work the next day and keep on working. For a pastor, that's different. I am glad that this is here, because it is putting a spotlight on what has been a problem for some pastors. Some pastors are lazy, and that's a problem. Some pastors throw themselves so headlong into the ministry and into the flock that they neglect their family, and their marriage suffers, and their children suffer, or they start to just be so two-faced that I have my kind of pastor mode, then I have my home mode, and their children naturally begin to see that, begin to lack respect, and the gravitas of the man begins to wane in his own home because he's so two-faced all the time. And those things should not be of pastors. They shouldn't be. Now, pray for me, right? I'm at a spot, I have 4 kids, my oldest is 10. I'm still at the spot where they all look up to me very easily. They're all still pretty controllable, I'm entering over the next few years, teen years, and these years where let's see if my foundation has actually been laid the proper way to be able to do this and do this well. But there's an expectation that you do this well. There should be an expectation from the church family that, hey, we want you to do this well. And I don't say this as a reproof in any way, shape, or form, because you all as a church, to me, to our other pastors, I think even pastors historically, best I know, to Kurt, you all have been unbelievably, I think, mindful and willing to say, listen, go invest in your family. Be here, work hard, do the work of pastoring, but at the same time, we don't mind you taking vacation. We don't mind you going home, your family or your wife's family, spending time. You all have always encouraged that and prioritized that, and to that end, I am very grateful because you make it an easier runway for us as pastors to be able to live this out, because we want to live this out. No man wants to lose their family and sacrifice them on the altar of ministry. That's a bad trade. It's a terrible trade. So he needs to have his house in order. There's also this idea in verse number 6 that he's not a novice. Lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into condemnation of the devil. Here is one of two admonitions that are unique for a pastor that are not unique for every Christian. Not a novice, or you could say they're not new to faith. You don't take the new recruit or the private and put a bunch of stripes on their chest and a general hat on their head and say, you're the general. That's a recipe for disaster. You don't do that in the church either. Someone who is new to faith has a role to play and can have some responsibilities and can do a lot. If you're new to faith, I want to encourage you, you have an evangelistic window that is different for those who are not new to faith. You have people around you that you can bring to church and bring to Christ that some others cannot. And I want to encourage you to lean into that if you're new to faith. Invite them to church, share the gospel with them, make big of that. But a pastor should not be someone who's a novice or new to faith. One that I skipped over purposefully, and you may have noticed this, is the other phrase that is uniquely required of a pastor. It is the phrase, I believe it's at the end of verse 2, maybe 3, apt to teach. He has the ability or the aptitude to be able to teach, specifically to transfer the scriptures to other people. This could take a lot of shapes and sizes. This could be in personal discipleship. This could be in a small group. This could be in an open Bible study. This could be in the high school chapel. This could be in the nursing home. This could be in the pulpit ministry that happens on Sunday morning. This could be in our growth track classes on Sunday evening. There's lots of ways and avenues to teach, but it is a prerequisite for a pastor that is not required of a deacon, that there is an ability to be able to teach and to take the scriptures and accurately communicate them to other people. That's required. It's part of the job. You will never find in the job, he has to go to seminary and he needs this level of education. He needs this level of IQ. He needs to be this personality type. You never find any of that. You never find that he needs to counsel well. Most of you know I do very little to zero ongoing regular counseling. Number 1, because I'm not good at it. Number 2, because I don't enjoy it. And number 3, because it's not really in my job description. It's not to say that no pastor can ever do any of that, but to the extent that counseling begins to erode and eat away at the study in the scriptures, that's a bad trade. There's apt to teach. This is actually, Lori is my assistant. She helps me arrange my schedule and things like that. She would be able to tell you that one of the first things we do every single week, we meet Tuesday afternoons and we line some things out. One of the first things that we do is we look at my calendar, not just next week, but 2 weeks out, and make sure that I have blocks of time to study, specifically 8 to 10 work hours. There's another somewhere between 4 and 6 hours that are kind of outside of normal work hours that will go into a sermon, which means I have to make sure every single week that there's somewhere between 12 to 15 hours to be able to put together content and study and look, and that's reading books, that's reading articles, that's listening to other sermons, that is just reading the text and sitting in the text and asking it questions, commentaries. There's a lot that goes into that, but that is a unique part of my job that I have to carve out large chunks of time. The largest chunks of time are given to that because it's part of pastoral ministry, and it should be expected that chunks of time will be given to that. I did have to learn the lesson, I will say, when I was younger in ministry. Thursday was my study day. It was a big chunk. And you learn the hard way, not only do you have to put that time on the calendar, but put it early in the week. Because as a pastor, sometimes you get to Thursday and you have this time for study, and then someone has a stroke and is being rushed to the hospital, and that emergency just interrupts your whole day. And then you have 2 days to scramble to try to figure out how to fit it all in, and it disrupts everything. And I've lived on that roller coaster on a handful of occasions, and it's miserable. And I've had to learn, put that early in the week. So Monday now, 9 weeks out of 10, Monday is my prep day. If you try to get a hold of me on Monday, even the staff knows. Like, you can send a pigeon, but you can call me. I'm not going to answer. Like, I'm going to try to sink in and get that sermon close to done by the end of that day and just really dive in. Why? Well, because there's a teaching ministry in the pastorate that should be expected. Verse 7, last one. Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into reproach and snare of the devil. Meaning his reputation cannot just be inside of the community of saints, but his reputation to the outsiders, to the unbelievers, to the people at Walmart is important as well. His neighbor should not learn he's a pastor and be floored because he just acts like everybody else. That shouldn't be the case for a pastor. Those are unique rules. You say, Pastor, what am I supposed to do with those? Well, we're supposed to align our expectations as to what is required of a pastor to be in pastoral ministry. That's what's required. A lot of churches will put a lot of things in the job description or require pastors that are like, frankly, God never required that. That's what's required. What are the responsibilities that he has? This will become more practical. Let's hit it quickly. 1 Peter chapter number 5. We've already covered several, right? He has to be hospitable, which means he needs to be around people. He should be a shepherd. He should be with the flock. He is the bishop overseer, meaning there's some sort of organization and there's some sort of caretaking responsibility and leadership involved. He's an elder and apt to teach, so he teaches. All of these are true. But Peter tells you this, and I love it. He says, the elders which are among you I exhort. Okay, here is an exhortation specifically to elder, pastor, bishops, who am also an elder. I'm with you guys. I'm in the same boat. I'm an elder too. And I'm a witness of the sufferings of Christ and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Here's the exhortation to pastors. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight, excuse me, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being in samples or examples to the flock. There's a lot there. Number one, I want to note, elders feed the flock, elder, pastor, same people. Take the oversight thereof, that's the bishop. Same people, elder, pastor, bishop. They're not distinct. They're synonyms with each other. But I want you to do this in a particular way. And this speaks to the dangers that are unique when you begin to have a local church that isn't controlled by a denominational hierarchy or isn't controlled by a regional bishop or superintendent or council of bishops or whatever else. When you begin to have a church that it's the saints and the pastors and the deacons, that's it. Well, couldn't this go wrong? It could go wrong. And he speaks to that. Number one, the pastor could be an absolute dictator. And he says there's no place for that. You need to lead, you need to have the oversight, you need to feed. But it is not by constraint. Willingly they should let you. It is not as a lord over God's heritage, that somehow you're just the boss. No, it's by your example. They should want to follow you by your example, not because you're heavy-handed, not because you're a bully, not because you're twisting their arm, not because, well, it's my position and you have to respect my position. None of that. Right? And there are a lot of churches that are local where pastors have become, I'm the man of God, I'm the pastor, you better listen to me, and they bully people and they shame people and they guilt trip people and they do that all day long, and he says, no, that ain't how it's done. I put it this way, the church is not a monarchy where the pastor is the king. That's not how it is. At the same time, the church is not a democracy where the general populace just votes on everything and decides, hey, we'll let consensus rule. Well, that's not what it described. It described pastors leading. It described pastors who had oversight. It described a particular function of particular individuals that a healthy church will have a number of them who have the spiritual caretaking of the church and are setting the direction and are legitimately leading and feeding. So a pastor can both be too dominant or too passive. And there are some pastors that are too passive. That they basically let the church do whatever they want, and they describe it as a congregational model where the congregation votes on everything, decides everything, is in charge of basically everything, and they just pay me a salary to go prepare a sermon and show up and preach the sermon and then, be at the funeral and the wedding if I need to be. The end. That's not pastoring. That's not leading. And congregations will oftentimes unwittingly set the stage for this, and you don't want to set the stage for this, where we have to vote on everything, and everyone has to have a say in everything, and everyone has to be informed of every decision, and everyone has to, and it's like that's so impractical, and it robs you of leadership because the leaders don't want to lead in that context. If you have someone in that context, either A, they'll be way too passive and they'll stick around for a long time and you'll never really have a leader, or if you actually have a leader, they'll run. They may spend 2 years at the church, but those churches chew through pastors every 2 to 3 years constantly. And they're constantly like, what's going on? What's wrong? It's like, well, you're not letting the guy lead. Oftentimes, there'll be like a business meeting every month in these sorts of churches where anyone can discuss anything and everyone knows everything financially, and we're going to vote on every little thing. Anyone been a part of a church that's been like that in the past? Okay, a handful of you have. Now tell me if I'm lying. If you're going to the monthly business meeting, bring some headgear and a mouth guard. Like, you better buckle up. Because half the people in that room are going to go Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and they're going to go crazy. And it's like, who are you? What do you do? What are we on about? And there is contention, and there is fighting, and nobody wants to lead a contentious business meeting where everybody fights every month. It's miserable. So the pastors end up saying, like, I'm out. I'm gone. And the reason that's happening is because the church has too much control. So there's this unique balance. Like, what is the church? Well, is it a monarchy? Is it a democracy? No, it's its own thing. It's its own thing. We'll talk about deacons and how they serve and how there is accountability and those sorts of things next week. But the point is this. You can do this in a very healthy way, biblical way that works really, really well, or you can do it in a very unhealthy way, and it'll really come apart at the seams very quickly. You don't want a dictator, and you don't want someone who won't lead. You want a pastor or pastors that will lead, oftentimes as a team. The last thing I'll say is that there are rewards. I'm going to leave these texts for you to read on your own, but there are at least 2 rewards that are mentioned for a pastor. One is very temporal, and one is very eternal. The temporal reward is mentioned in 1 Timothy 5, which is simply that of compensation, some sort of financial remuneration. Now, it is very clear that a pastor should not be in it for the money. If a pastor is getting rich, that probably is a bad setup. Now, maybe they've inherited some money and they invested it well or something, fine, He didn't take a vow of poverty. But there is some sort of compensation that might be due. Not always. We, from time to time, have had lay elders or pastors here who have served without any compensation whatsoever. But as a rule of thumb, ours are compensated in some way. And the analogy that Paul gives is that you wouldn't have an animal who worked on the farm, an ox, who went out and plowed the field and did all the work, and then you never fed them anything or gave them any water. You wouldn't do that. You would give them what they needed to survive, maybe even thrive, so they could continue to bless you and continue to help you. And he says, well, the pastors, it's no different. That may need to be the case. He even goes on to say that those who do it well are worthy of double honor and really pay attention and try to care for them. I want to say that our deacons do a lot of this, probably on your behalf, but you all as a church do a great job of being mindful, of making sure, do you have enough time with your family? Not everyone asks me this every week or anything, but you do a great job of expecting me and our other pastors to work. You should expect that, but also expecting, hey, there should be a balance here, and you shouldn't be in the poorhouse and not able to go to McDonald's if you want to, and you shouldn't be so burnt out that you have no time for your family. You all do a great job of this. So there's no criticism or complaint here. It's just a point that's made that there is a temporal reward for a pastor and that there could be some sort of compensation. There's also an eternal reward in 1 Peter 5 that is mentioned that is the pastor's crown. There's lots of crowns in the Bible. This is one that is unique. And how all that works exactly, I don't even pretend to know. But I know this much. It's specifically mentioned that there are rewards in heaven for pastors who do it well. Not perfectly, but faithfully, lovingly, caringly, wanting to pastor and guide the flock. Now, all this is vitally important. I know it feels like a college class this morning, and for that, I do apologize to some extent. But this is vitally important because God's plan for reaching the world is going to run through the local church. God's plan, to some extent, for growing and maturing you in your faith is going to run through the local church. So how that local church is structured, established, who does what, how, that's an important question for a church to wrestle with. It's an important one to go to the scriptures and try to say, what does this look like biblically? Let's try to model that. That's the point of today. The last thing I'll say is that while a pastor can do many things for you, there are some things that he cannot do for you. There's a lot he can't do for you, actually. Namely, he cannot save or even shepherd or even bishop your soul. According to Hebrews, a pastor can watch for your soul, and that they could be on the lookout with binoculars, and they could find things that would do damage to your heart's love for Jesus and try to point them out for you and say, beware. But a pastor cannot save your soul, nor even shepherd or oversee or take care of your soul. That is a job, according to Peter, that is uniquely reserved for the Lord Jesus, who is known as the capital S shepherd and capital B bishop of our souls. So a pastor can do many things, but never make the mistake of thinking that a pastor is somehow in the position of the Lord Jesus. If you've had good pastors in your life, be grateful for them. But they all report to and are subject to Jesus. If you have never had your soul, could I say it this way, overseen or cared for, like a good bishop or shepherd would do, then go to Jesus this morning. Ask him to save you. Ask him to redeem you. Ask him to oversee your soul, and he will.